So I thought it would also be useful to kind of talk about basically things I wish someone told me. So to kick it off, so I don't know, you're probably wondering who this guy is. If you click me on LinkedIn, appreciate it. Thanks for the view. I completed my BSc Human Kinetics at the University of Guelph, so pretty close to Toronto. Played varsity soccer and worked at biomechanics lab. Working in the biomechanics lab, that's where it kind of really came together for me. I knew I loved sports, was all right at math, liked science, and that was kind of the meeting point of all those interests. So that kind of led me to a PhD in human kinetics at the University of Ottawa. My thesis was neuromusculoskeletal modeling of ACL injuries. So that's basically computational modeling. We took the MRI diagnostic images, made patient-specific knees in the model, and then modeled the ligament and muscle forces and joint contact forces before and after the ACL reconstructions. And after that, started a postdoc in data science. So that was kind of applying machine learning and AI methods to health and performance applications. And then also during that time, kind of fell into a consulting role for the Cincinnati Reds. And then shortly after that, became director of R&D for Apex Skating. Apex Skating is based out of Ottawa. We have also an office in LA, and it's basically a hockey performance company. So a lot of it is skating. Obviously, is a big component of hockey. So skating, kind of one-on-one sessions, anything like that. We do a fair bit of R&D with kind of motion capture, motion analysis. And what you guys are probably all here to hear about is Assistant Director of Performance Integration for LA Angels. So this is coming up and finishing my second year with the Angels. And at this point, you're probably wondering what the heck performance integration is. So it's a very extremely multifaceted kind of department because we're trying to integrate, obviously, various departments together. So we act as the bridge or like the hub to, medical, strength and conditioning, scouting, analytics, and the coaches. So some specifics on that are tech. So any new technologies that, we're constantly bombarded by companies trying to sell us their tech and get us to work with them. So one of my big roles is to kind of vet that technology, make sure it actually is a valid tool, make sure it does what the company says it can do. And then if we decide to go begin a relationship with that company, the next step is how do we integrate it into the organization? So how do we get the data from that piece of technology into the analysis pipelines and then back out to the coaches and players? The next example is scouting. So I travel to the workouts to collect data with all the different technologies, help collect the athleticism measurables, and then also help with the draft model. So how do we rate athleticism? Should a guy get punished for this, and should he get a bump in his ranking for that? Then research, we conduct studies and analysis on how to improve our players, anything kind of related to the sports science of how to make our guys bigger, faster, stronger, healthier, better baseball players all around. That kind of falls under our scope. We work with the coaches to kind of build tools to better assist their day-to-day. So when they're communicating with a player, what would help them best communicate that message or best communicate what the quant group is doing with those analysis and those models? How do we make it easier and digestible so that knowledge translation to the players? And then medical player monitoring. So you might think, you work for the Angels or you work for a baseball team and there's 26, 28 guys on the big league roster. It's actually, you work for the entire organization, right? Same in hockey, you work with the AHL. In soccer, you work with the academy all the way down. So it's not just those 26 players you're trying to monitor. It's actually all 7 or 8 affiliates. So your numbers are 250 players that need to keep tabs on, and they could be spread all over the United States and Dominican. So it's really focused. It's really important to have a focused central hub that kind of data streams come in when players like their games and any kind of data collections you do, and then it's analyzed and it kind of goes back out. So that's pretty important. So yeah, as I said, this conversation or this presentation is mainly a collection of thoughts I wish someone told me when I was kind of in grad school and kind of finishing up and trying to make that move into the industry. If you have any questions, as Abdul said, shoot them in the chat. I'll definitely leave some time to answer any specifics you guys have. So like any good sports analytics presentation, we're obviously going to begin with cholera. So cholera, it was running rampant in the 1800s, especially through London, England. And Dr. John Snow, he was an obstetrician. He was kind of very prominent in the kind of the anesthesia world for kind of birthing and things like that. But he was determined. He was very, very convinced that cholera was caused by contaminated water, where this was opposed to kind of the popular belief that it was atmospheric miasma. So atmospheric miasma is just like bad air, they called it. It's like dead, rotting carcasses, and then it made the air turn foul, and then that's how you got cholera. It was Black Plague, like the Black Death. That was the same belief, was miasma. That's why the plague doctors wore those big masks to kind of filter out that air. Well, John's like, no way, it's definitely contaminated water, and I'm going to prove it. I'm going to do a bunch of work. So he found the kind of first clues that he found cholera followed shipping lanes. So again, if you're a sailor and you leave your main port and you ship off and then you land in another port, no one was getting sick kind of on the way there, right? So it was only when they would land in the contaminated areas and bring the water on, and then they'd get sick on the ship. Well, if it's bad air due to rotting carcasses, whatever, they're at sea. So that doesn't make sense, right? So he kind of found that it was the water that they took on from those ports that was contaminated, that were the fresh water that they would bring on the boat with them, and that's how they were getting sick. Another one was poor communities were affected to a greater extent. So this also doesn't fit miasma theory, because bad air doesn't care if you're rich or poor. It's just going to go where air flows, right? So this was kind of the beginnings of his what made him convinced that this wasn't the case. So what he did, he created a clustering map and found the infamous Broad Street pump. So this is a pump kind of in I think it was northwest London, but everyone around this pump was sick for some reason, and he'll kind of attest to it, but they ended up taking the handle off the pump and cholera cases plummeted. And so it was interesting. He'll never say that it was because of this pump. It was like cases were actually decreasing, but it was a good kind of approach to figuring out like where people were getting sick, and taking that approach of a very widespread approach. It was interesting. There was a poor house near the Broad Street pump, but had few cases. Well, why was that? Well, it's because they had their own well. They weren't actually going to the Broad Street pump. They were actually getting water from their own well that wasn't contaminated, because in the Broad Street pump, people were just dumping dirty diapers and fecal matter into the well. So that was what was making everyone sick. Another example, there was a large brewery right beside the pump, but they weren't having any cases either, the workers and everything. And he's like, well, why was that? Well, they were actually drinking the beer. They were drinking the beer that, gets the contaminants get filtered out when you turn the water into the beer. So everything was kind of lining up for him. And then the final kind of nail in the coffin for it was the Lambeth Water Company. They had few cases, whereas Southwark and Vauxhall had a ton of cases. Well, it turns out the Thames River that runs through London, Lambeth actually took their water from above where the city dumped the sewage into the Thames, whereas Southwark and Vauxhall were taking it below, downstream of where the sewage was being dumped. So that's why Lambeth was having all these clean, lack of cases compared to their competitors. So, what this means for the real world is, unlike school assignments and kind of academia, the data sets are very complex, and there's no answer key, right? You can't kind of flip to the back of the book and find the result. The kind of solutions are very gray, right? And since they are that way, they're not cut and dry. Experts will really disagree on a lot of the fundamentals, because they bring their experience, they bring their expertise, and kind of they bat heads. And so it's very difficult, because you also can't do randomized control trials, which are the gold standard. So how to combat that? So just because we can't do those intervention studies with a control group, John Snow here, he took the shoe leather approach. What it's called is that he surveyed 300,000 people in London to find out who was kind of getting sick and what was those patterns and everything. So this is the same in the current day in the industry, is that we can't run randomized control trials with our players, because it's one, their career on the line, and two, they're too valuable to kind of do something that we know will likely be a negative, right? So we have to take these kind of shoe leather approaches and kind of explore different hypotheses. And the other key is to find actual experiments that control the variables for you. So Snow did this with a clustering map around the Broad Street pump, which you can kind of see there. And, example of this is if we want to know, how does protein uptake, so like how do our players recovery based off the amount of protein they take? Well, we can't just tell half our players to no longer eat meat. That's just not going to fly. But there are some players that are vegetarians. So that's kind of how we can find those natural experiments, because those vegetarians connect as our control group versus the meat eaters, right? So that's kind of what the more appropriate approach in industry versus academia. But relating to that is this idea of correlation does not equal causation. And I'm sure you've heard this, and I come from a health science background, so it was definitely treated as this was law. This was, if two things are correlated, it does not mean they're cause and effect. And, this has kind of been a turning point for me, because it can be true, right? So one example, so kind of going through this, is it's a process called causal inference. So there's three things that need to be true for causal inference. Is that one, X must come before Y. So going back to our caller example, is that you can't get sick before drinking the container water. The container water has to be drunk before they get sick, right? That makes sense. Relationship of X and Y didn't happen by chance, so there has to be kind of a connected relationship there, and there's no confounders. So the perfect example of this is, I'm sure you've all heard of the ice cream sales. So this is the famous textbook example of ice cream sales and drowning cases have a positive correlation, but obviously they don't cause each other, right? Well, it turns out there's a confounder of temperature. When it's hotter, people eat more ice cream and they drown more because they go swimming more in the summer months. Well, it's interesting that everyone kind of assumes the temperature is the cause for both of these, but no one ended up doing an intervention or randomized control study on this. No one is playing God and just like flicking the temperature switch and changing that in summer. We know that because in summer, there's that natural experiment where it gets hot and people eat more ice cream and people go swimming and drown more versus the winter. So it's very interesting how they teach you in school that correlation does not equal causation, and then they give you this example of how temperature is a confounder, but in the end, that is causal inference. No one actually did that intervention study. So again, this is a very important method, because again, those randomized trials don't really happen in real life too much. So how do you do causal inference? There's kind of three big methods of that we typically use. Is the natural experiment, so snow and clustering maps, finding out, those vegetarians versus meat eaters, things like that. The differences in differences. So if you were to, change a weightlifting program and you want to know how that affects their fastball velo off the mound, right? The amount that they changed in the weight lifted, if that is a positive change from the beginning to end of the program, and it's also a positive change in their fastball velo, those differences, if those show a correlation, you can likely attribute that to a causation, right? You can turn that correlation into a causation. And the last one is regression discontinuity. This is pretty popular, especially in politics with the election coming up. And this is where you only give a subset of your group a treatment. So in this case, in this example here, we have blood pressure and cardiovascular events. So they treated anyone over 150 blood pressure with a drug, for example. And originally they would have seen this group would have naturally been up here, because the higher the blood pressure, the more cardiovascular events you'd expect. But after treatment, there's a discontinuity in the regression, see here, and this can be determined as a treatment effect. If you want to know more about causal inference, I recommend the Book of Why by Judea Pearl. It's a very good kind of jumping off point. Another perfect example, this is smoking. So this is how we determine smoking is bad for you, even though doctors, the experts, were saying it was fine. Well, we never did an intervention and control study saying, you guys smoke, we'll catch you in 30 years, you guys smoke every day. Or so you guys don't smoke, then you guys smoke for 30 years, then we'll track you. They just did that kind of natural experiment through and applied causal inference. So the next kind of thing moving from that is a topic called super forecasting, and this is kind of that causal inference is applied in the super forecasting. So it was called the Good Judgment Project. It started off in, I believe, 2011, and the goal of these researchers was just to find out how people make decisions about future probabilistic events. And some key things that came out of this project that we should take away as analysts was that we as humans have and always will have biases, and teaming up with others only helps and to fight those biases. So when you're working on something, if we are wondering if it's a player's value is correct, well, we poll everyone in the organization, and even though some people will be low, some people will be high, that kind of range is where they end up, which the players kind of typically end up being. And this is a very strong thing, strong kind of attack plan super forecasters are like the best forecasters do. The other thing they learned is that most effective teams are diverse and well-rounded. So you want to get ideas and opinions from a bunch of different viewpoints, right? If you take this one-lane approach, you get this tunnel vision, which we all know is inappropriate. And this kind of talks to the idea of the fox versus the hedgehog, so the generalist versus the specialist, where the fox is a generalist. So the idea becomes where a fox, they're cunning, they're always trying to find different ways to trick their prey into being captured, whereas the hedgehog does one thing and it does it well, right? Every time it's threatened, it rolls up into the ball and lets the spikes kind of defend themselves. So that's the difference between a generalist and specialist approach. And you want to be a generalist, right? We call ourselves specialized generalists, right? Like, for example, my specialty is biomechanics, but to be good at this integration job, we need to kind of generalize between a lot of different platforms. And another thing they did is diverge, evaluate, and converge. So this means you have a research question, you define the research question, and then everyone breaks out, does their own work, develops their own ideas, evaluates the data, and then comes back. So this is a very effective way of combating groupthink, but it still provides solidified conclusions, right? Because you're coming back and then you adjust your analysis based off how everyone else was thinking, because you likely didn't think of something that someone else in your group thought of. And finally, the thing was track your progress and get feedback. So same with your model. If you're training your model and you don't have that kind of validation set, if you don't know the outcome when you're trying to train your model is going to be garbage, right? Because you don't know how it fared. Us humans are the same way. That's how we learn. We learn, as kids, like, is that hot? I'm going to put my hand on it. Oh man, that was hot. I'm going to take it off. That feedback tells you not to do that again, and you learn, right? And the big thing with this is don't be afraid to adjust your model or your conviction when new and negative results come back in. Like, if you are going to stick to your model that is wrong, that's just silly, right? Like, you're going to lose kind of your audience, and it's just not effective. As you learn, adapt to that new knowledge. The other thing the super fat forecasters acknowledged is how poor average, taking the average, how poor that recommendation is. So we're going to talk about another quick story here. So in the 1940s, the U.S. Air Force was struggling with an onslaught of non-combat crashes. So this would be upon landing, any kind of crash that wasn't during like a dogfight, right? But the pilots and the mechanics just, when they were being interviewed, they just didn't know. They're like, I don't know, it just didn't work out. I just crashed. Like, I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that. So they got this idea that the cockpit design was based on average dimensions of hundreds of pilots from 1926. So like, even every fighter pilot wore the same size helmet, right? They didn't even consider head size. Imagine trying to wear the helmet of someone else. Like, it would just, squish your head. It'd be horrible. The same thing with the cockpit, the seats, like your knees could be up to your chest because they just didn't fit. So they were thinking like, all right, these pilots in the 1940s, their formative puberty years were during the Great Depression. Maybe the body size had changed. Maybe they couldn't reach the pedals because they were malnourished as a preteen, things like that. So they remeasured 140 dimensions, so like height, weight, arm length, leg length, things like that, on 4,000 pilots in the 1950s, and they redesigned the cockpit. So problem solved, right? So everything they just took those averages of those 4,000 pilots and said, more data, this has got to be better, right? Well, they used the top 10 measures to calculate a new average pilot for those new cockpit dimensions. And I'm curious, I don't know if the chat is here, if you want to quickly guess the number of pilots out of the 4,000 pilots that fit that average profile. So those top 10, so that average height, we'll just like height, leg length, limb length, things like that. How many pilots of those 4,000 kind of fit those 10 dimensions? So exactly zero fit. Yeah, you guys got it right there. So what else I found interesting is when they just took 3 dimensions, like the 3 kind of dimensions they thought were most important. So for example, we'll just say height, arm length, leg length. 3.5% fit just 3 dimensions average. So how are you going to design a cockpit when one guy might have extra long arms, but they can't reach the pedals, right? So it's those kind of things where the average ended up being detrimental. So when you're trying to represent a group of people, average probably isn't the best idea. And then so in 1952, the Air Force customized cockpits and non-contact crashes just plummeted. Like, sorry, that was a bad play on words, but you know, if you're driving your car and you move the seat back or you adjust the mirrors, things like that, we need to thank this work for acknowledging that average doesn't fit. Not even everybody, doesn't fit anyone, right? So if you want to learn more about the end of average, I definitely recommend Todd Rose's book, The End of Average. It's very good. So now kind of shifting this to sports is, you know, what about averages in sports? We always hear about batting average, you know, average fastball velo. So, you know, when we talk about baseball pitches, if you have an average MLB pitch, you know, we have this normal distribution curve up in the top right corner. You have to remember, if you're average here, this is the pitch that all the batters are seeing most often. So it's going to be much easier for them to kind of learn that pitch and be able to react to it better. Versus if you have kind of a different pitch, so if you have this kind of bimodal distribution, you know, this mean that everyone else is seeing, if you live in these areas, you're hitting areas these batters haven't seen before. So it will likely play much better. And this is what pitch development is. It's all about differentiating your pitches. So if you have a fastball that typically like has what we call ride, so it kind of looks like it's traveling up and it might have some run. You want your curveball, for example, say your fastball's that you throw it at 96 miles per hour, you want your curveball at like 80 miles per hour. You want that big differentiation velo, and instead of kind of looking like it goes up, it actually curves down, right? Because when the pitcher has to make that split-second decision, not only do you have that speed differential between your pitches, you also have to trick the batter to covering about 4 feet of space between what we call break, between a fastball that kind of goes up versus a curveball that goes down, right? So that's what kind of how averages can be, you know, can play to not your favor in sports. Another example is that we see this so much in kind of any movements of any sports is that this one size fits all. So if we take this regression model based off all the averages and say like, all right, the fastest velo has this kind of arm slot, this kind of shoulder positioning, the fastest skater has this leg extension, things like that. Well, you know, based off a player's mobility and able to move through the range of motion, they likely can't do that, right? So that's why it's, when possible, you need to include the within participant effect in your model. So you see here, this is just a plot of ball velocity, so how hard a pitcher can throw, and their elbow valgus torque. So Surveyor's torque. So how much like stress is put on the elbow joint, because if you have too much stress on your elbow joint, if you tear that ulnar collateral ligament, you need Tommy John surgery and you're out for a year, right? But if you look at this data set as a population, there's not a relationship here. Your correlation, your model would have a very hard time picking this up. But if you model this within participant effect, you see them here, that it models it very well, right? Because every player moves differently, but they all follow that same pattern, is that the harder the participant throws, they do cause more stress, but they just cause it differently between each other. So that's what's important. And you're kind of maybe wondering there, it's like, all right, great, we're getting into more complicated models. But we also need to talk about complicated is also not always better, right? There's this fine line. And to kind of demonstrate this, I want to talk about a random forest model that came out of the Technical University of Dortmund in 2018. So they used random forest to predict number of goals each team scores in a game. So each kind of head-to-head match, they would estimate the number of goals predict the number of goals, and then whoever scored more goals obviously won. So they did a very interesting job. You have to commend them on their effort, because their inputs included things like team structure, so like a 4-4-2, what was the kind of the age of the players, all of that. They included the country's wealth, so like the GDP, so how rich they were, as it's like, their program, their football program would be better, their soccer program would be better if they're a richer country, the coach experience, the team ranking, etc., all these different things. And you're probably curious how they did. Well, they got 11 correct, 3 partial, and 2 wrong in the group stage. And in the knockout stage, it all fell apart. But what I want to point out here, these 11 correct, like if you're looking at Spain, Portugal, in a group with Morocco and Iran, that's a pretty easy prediction to do, right? And same with like Group G, Belarus and Belgium and England versus Panama and Tunisia. A lot of people could argue you didn't need to consider all of these things. You could just use FIFA ranking basically to figure this out, right? So I don't know if you guys ever heard of Paul the Octopus. So in 2010, he was an octopus in a Berlin zoo, and they had 2 boxes in his aquarium, right? And they put food in both those boxes, and they put the flag of the matchup on both boxes. And then whatever box Paul went to go eat his food out of, that was the team that won. Well, turns out he was 8 for 8. He did a lot better than this model. And I'm not saying all your analysis should just be done by a zoo animal, things like that, but you can kind of see that you can put in a ton of work and it may not pay off as much as kind of simplistic models. So with that, the big kind of recommendation is learn the basics and learn them well, right? Like every kind of advanced model has simplistic foundations that you need to kind of be thinking about. So, even though you want to spend time applying neural networks and all these fancy models, spend more time developing thoughtful, distinct, and testable research questions. The amount of time coaches come to us and say, like, how can you fit a model to this question? You're like, well, that's not a testable question, and it kind of fits this garbage in, garbage out. If your data set or your question are garbage going into the model, the results coming out aren't going to be applicable, and you're not going to be able to discern anything and discern the signal from the noise. And the kind of second point is don't get caught up in the AI craze. Please don't. AI is great. It's making great leaps forward, but if you don't have a good testable research question, it's not appropriate. It's not an end all be all. You just can't throw it at a wall and let it kind of figure it out. Because again, if you're going to use principal components, like how do you explain that to a coach? Things like that. So, and the one thing I want to point out is, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the Kaggle competitions. It's not a coincidence that regression models and XGBoost are the perennial top performers. So, I very much recommend starting with those kind of 2 regressions in the classifications of XGBoost, and kind of if they are unsatisfactory, why are they producing unsatisfactory results? If they can't figure it out, it's probably your data. And then if it's not, if your data is good and you're convinced, then kind of move on to more advanced methods. And take the time to fully understand each model's strengths and weaknesses. It's very important to know when a model can be applied to this situation and when it should not be applied to that situation, right? And play with parameter tuning and try to break your model. That's the best way to kind of test your model and see how much it bends and flexes and how robust it is, and see where it works and where it doesn't. Because where it doesn't work, that's where you can kind of learn, like, where either it's a bug in my code, or it's just like an anomaly in the data that I need to kind of create a new feature to account for that weird person or thing. And this is huge. Don't lose your research integrity. So, as the network you guys hear in the academic setting, you're going to be surrounded by people that know what you're talking about and that will question you and test you because they're like-minded. They have the kind of similar backgrounds likely, but you need to remember, in the industry, you might be the only person within that organization that knows what you're doing and what it means. So it becomes a lot easier to take shortcuts, and they become very appealing, but you don't have those fact checkers for you. So it's as much as you want to be like, it's probably not a big deal, it's up to you to kind of keep that integrity. And one of the, this quote came from a GM to me, and it was very interesting. because it meant a lot, because in academia and stuff, you want to, a lot of times in the world, you want to make things perfect because it has your name on it, right? You're responsible for it. So you want it to be the best it can possibly be. But, you know, you said to me one time, a good model on time is worth a lot. A perfect model a day late is useless. So think of draft day. If we don't have our draft model ready on the morning of draft day, the model doesn't matter how perfect it is. If it's not ready, it's no good. So this kind of goes along with the idea of the minimum viable product, and that the minimum viable product is just get a beta version out as fast as possible, get it in, see if it breaks, see how well it does, garner feedback, and see how people kind of respond to that, and let that direct your efforts instead of you just being on your computer and just trying to figure out yourself. You know, it's that teamwork approach, polling people, collaborating with people, that really helps. And if you're interested more in that, the Lean Startup by Eric Ries is a good place for that. So kind of moving on to this topic, predicting injuries. This topic obviously needs to come up with a sports analytics group. I know it's extremely appealing, but there's a lot of things you need to think about if you're going to go down this route. So the first one is injuries are very rare. So most basic models will predict no injury all the time and are 99% correct, right? So, you know, they are very costly. Injuries are very costly, so it's a very appealing thing to do, to spend your time, but you know, it's not a simple thing to do. So another thing is that contact injuries are random. So your model's likely exclusive to non-contact injuries. That's probably fine for baseball or soccer, but if you're trying to American football or hockey, like, think of the amount of non-contact injuries and think if your time can be spent better elsewhere, because you're likely not going to be able to create those contact injuries. And you have to think about, there's so many different types of injuries. So if your model is great and it flags an injury, you're going to walk to the training staff, you're going to walk to the coach and say, like, hey, we got to pull so-and-so because he's going to get in. Our model shows that he's going to get injured today. And they're going to look at you like, all right, well, how serious is the injury? Are we talking like a blister that he'll be out for, like he can't make this start? Is it, you know, is he going to need Tommy John? Is he going to tear his groin? Is he going to tear a hamstring? Like, you need to think, like, what's the severity in sight and, you know, the cause of it, because these are the questions that are going to be asked. And if your model is not going to be able to likely factor in all those different things, because they're going to want, like, do we need to strengthen a different area? What is causing that risk of injury? And then there's effective misclassification. So say you flag someone that's going to be injured and they don't ever get injured, or you flag them as like a false positive, or you say they're going to get, a false negative, or you don't say they're going to get injured and they do get injured, you're going to lose a lot of that trust with your staff, and they're not going to kind of come back to you looking for those recommendations. So the misclassifications in this are very serious. And then you think about, all right, so this player's flagged for injury, we're going to remove them from play. Well, you just removed that player from your model validation pool. So now your model can't learn from that and figure out, was that a false positive or was it a true positive? So it becomes a lot of issues with that. And we have the decisions to remove a player are very complex, are very multifaceted. So, you know, as a sports scientist or an analyst, you can say we need to remove this player, but is it Game 7 of the Stanley Cup? Is it Game 7 of the NBA Finals? Is this the player's last chance? Are they a bubble player and they might be, like, the contract might be waived after this? You know, what's the win probability of the player playing? You know, what's the player's attitude? It's as much as we want an organization to follow our models blindly, it's not going to happen, because as much as we may not think of it, sports is an entertainment industry. People come to watch your stars play. So you have to play them as much as possible, because, again, it's the entertainment business. And the other thing is that factors change in gameplay, but communication is not always allowed. So your model might say they're good to go, there's no risk of injury, but then they, over the course of 85 minutes of gameplay, they run 14 kilometers. That would likely change their injury risk. But, you know, at least in baseball, we can't go to the dugout and tell them, like, no, like, this guy's an injury risk. So the communication lines are closed, because, you know, that's a one route that cheating could happen, right? So, you know, how accurate is your model when things, you know, injuries are such like an instantaneous and dynamic process? They're not static like a model would treat it. So kind of taking all these things in consideration, would a readiness model suit your, so, what was like the, workload management, load management? I know it's starting to get kind of negative connotation, but how much has a relief pitcher been in 3 straight games? Well, that readiness model, we're not going to try and predict an injury in the 4th game. We just know, like, hey, this is a spike in their workload. This is a lot compared to what they're used to. We should probably rest them this one. That's a lot easier to get buy-in because you're not going and, sticking your neck out and saying like an injury, right? So you kind of need to kind of rethink of what would be an effective way to communicate these things. And with also injuries, it's important to think in probabilities. So this is really important to get comfortable thinking with Bayesian statistics, because everything isn't black and white, as I just said with injuries, right? There's risk. Your prior in Bayesian statistics with regards to injuries, that injuries are very rare, like a random number, 0.001% likely every time a player steps on the field that they might be injured, right? But then you think of, start applying the likelihood of injuries. So what's the event given your null hypothesis, given your prior, and say like, well, this player has a very large injury history, so you bump up that prior a little more, and that's how you kind of start to think how you kind of can make these things work. So instead, you work off of priors. It's either assumption or past work, and adjust from there. I really recommend start doing this in all things of your life. I think this really helped me because it's hard to think of probabilities, but if you just think like, what's the probability that I'll make that stoplight, right? Like given the information, things like that, because once you start thinking in life like that, you will be able to apply it to work a lot easier. And when you're doing this, justify every single % change. So this kind of comes from forecasting, is that everyone will likely say, like, if it's close, they'll be like, it's 50-50. But 50-50 is a very unlikely, like a true 50-50 outcome is very unlikely. It's 1 in 100, right? So, if someone tells you 50-50, it means they haven't given enough thought. So, people will say, I'd say it's 52-48, right? That means they've started at kind of 50-50, that broad prior, and then kind of adjusted and thought really hard about like, how do you get those 2%? So I really, it's really important to justify every single %, because the actual magnitude may not matter so much, but the thought process and the effort that goes into it will really help you. And to me, this is the perfect way to marry analytics and field with field experience. So that kind of like the traditional coach that doesn't like numbers in a spreadsheet, and if they think you're doing in Excel, like that's first an issue, that they think all analysis happens in Excel. But this is a way it works. So say like the probability of a pitcher giving up a lot of runs through the third, like his performance decreasing the 3rd time through the order, well, the probability of that is X, right? And, well, is he dealing? Like, is he throwing really well? Are the players swinging and missing? Like, that's how the player works. But so it's a way of anchoring and providing anchor point or prior to the coaches, so they have an idea, right? This is where I start, and then based off what I see in a game, this is how I'm going to adjust it to kind of help make that decision. But it's very helpful if they have those priors, those anchor points, because they don't get caught up in the game, right? They don't think of they don't have a biased opinion because you provided that to them. So kind of talking about this is, we've talked about coaches a bit. Now we need to think about the players. We've got to remember they're humans and they're not academics. So that adds chaos into the system, right? Control groups are tough to form. We talked about the mediating versus the vegetarian. It's very important with coaches and players to start small and build off those results. So start with the low-hanging fruit, and once trust is built, add layers, add more complex models. But if you're going to kind of walk into the clubhouse and say like, all right, this is my model, it predicts X, Y, and Z, they're just going to kind of gloss over their eyes, and you're going to lose them, right? Because again, they don't have the same background as you. You need to remember that, in baseball, at least, a lot of them come from Latin American countries. The highest education might be grade 2. So, like, not only can they not speak English or read or write English, they can't read or write in Spanish either. So, how are you going to communicate those complex models if you haven't built their trust through the more simpler models? And kind of going on to those communication issues, that you need to refine it to the player. So, if they're out in center field or kind of zone defense basketball, and you've got a set play where your model says they need to be 8 feet from their starting position, their anchor point, they need to be 8 feet back and 3 feet left, right? They're kind of going to look at their play card and they're going to be like, I don't know how much 8 feet is. It's about this, right? But you need to simplify it and say like, all right, you know, you have your anchor point, take 3 steps left and 3 steps towards that pole or that section right there, because it's a lot easier for them to kind of remember in that heuristic way. And understand your players. So, you know, which ones can handle a lot of information and which ones can't. Like some will kind of get inside their head and they think too much. But some are just ferocious for it. They want to know all the information. And so it's learning like, how does a player receive this information? Do they receive it well, or they ignore it and kind of do their own thing? So you don't want to waste your time on the players that will just ignore it. You have to kind of reach them a different way. And we talked about traditionalists, but you know, pushback from them isn't a bad thing. It just means there was a failure, an obstacle that you need to overcome. So it's an opportunity to criticize your own work, because if they don't believe it for X and Y reasons, well, you know, maybe you should try to model those X and Y and develop features to account for that and to get their buy-in that way. Because you got to remember, these guys and girls have been in this game for 10, 20, 50 years. Like, they probably know something that you may not be thinking of. And finally, always just remember, this is a career and livelihood you're impacting. So if you're just trying to get them to do something for the sake of it, it's not a good look. It's just like what we call a lack of feel. So you always have to remember, like, you're there to make them better, and like, this is maybe all they know. So you know, everything you do, it shouldn't be in the best, you know, interest of the model. It should be the best interest of the player and the organization. So that's really important. Like, you know, you may be able to walk away with this from the job, but if you mess a player up by giving them bad information, bad data, that could be their career. They could be their contract ripped up, and you know, they're out of the game for the rest of their lives. So kind of moving on to the kind of like what we can help you with, and kind of looking forward. Now we kind of looked at, you know, how you should think is where to look for jobs is kind of what I'm asked a lot. And unfortunately with COVID-19, a lot of teams are, you know, holding staff sizes or reducing staff sizes. So it's pretty rough out there, but that's just the reality of the situation. Jobs are typically posted shortly after playoffs, after they conclude, and kind of throughout the off season as budgets are approved. Just keep an eye out, because you know, there might be some during the season, but it's unlikely. But if there might be some turnover in staff, someone might leave the organization, things like that. But typically shortly after playoffs, because that's when kind of budgets and there's like a brief downtime before free agency really gets crazy. Places to look, so team websites will typically post them. Teamwork online is a very big one. I think like all the major 4 sports definitely go to teamwork online, and then just like turn the filter to player development. That's where you'll find a lot of your analytics jobs and front office jobs like that. LinkedIn, a lot of are posted on LinkedIn. Keep it out there. If you're more kind of like the biomechanist, Biomech L is another place there. So like the sports scientist, biomechanist for teams will typically go to that website because they're looking for, you know, a graduate degree in biomechanics. And then for baseball specifically, Fangraphs posts a lot of jobs, and you'll often see the same job posting across a bunch of like Teamwork, LinkedIn, and Fangraphs. But you know, the first place I'd look, is they're all consolidated, is probably Teamwork Online. That's probably the biggest one. And then I thought it'd be good to kind of go through the hiring process. So an example. So this is something, you know, I actually went through, and I can answer more questions after if you have any. But just to give you guys how rough it is, 800 applicants. So it's up to 800 applicants apply to front office openings. So it's crazy. So it's really important how you stand out. So round 1 for this job interview, I had to submit a CV, and then I had to provide written answers to questions. So things like, you know, what's my experience with these different models, anything like that. You know, what is my like, what would I do in this situation? And then round 2 was a phone interview with a couple, like, so it'd be like the direct report, maybe like one other analyst, and they would kind of ask questions, just kind of more to get to know you better. There wasn't too many kind of, what would you do in this situation? And that's the round 3. That's where it kind of came up with, the direct report, maybe the one higher, depending on the structure. But that was a lot of where they kind of throw you questions where, like, what if scenarios and how you would handle that, and how would you communicate to a player, like what's your strategy for setting up a model, or like data cleaning, like what's your process for things like that. And then the 4th round, it was a technical competency. This is very common for almost all sports analytics jobs, is that the team will send out a data set that you kind of work through. What's really interesting with this, though, is that there may not be a good answer to their questions. So they might just want to be hearing like how you approach a problem. They might just ask you to spend 5 hours tops on it, but they just want to see how you approach different problems and your thought process and kind of your competency through coding and kind of things like that. So if you kind of get this question and you get to the stage and it's predict injuries, for example, they know you probably can't develop a good injury prediction model within 4 or 5 hours of work, but they want to see how would you approach a problem, because honestly, like it's free labor for the team. We get to send a tough question that maybe the quant group is struggling with, and we get to collaborate. We get to pull others, kind of that super forecasting technique we said. And then round 5, there's very often in-person interviews. So, you could interview with 25 staff members over the course of 6 hours. It could be an hour-long interview with the analytics group, the quant group, and then you could, work your way up with ending with like 15 minutes with the GM or the president of operations, things like that. And this is just kind of like test the feel. You eat lunch with the organization, just kind of feel how it goes. So yeah, as I said, that's a true example of a hiring process. All of them won't be that intense. Some might be more intense. It's just kind of like the level you're kind of coming in at. So at this point, you might be wondering, like, well, what can you do? You maybe scared me a bit, Kenneth. Like, what's going on? What can I do to be better and get my foot in the door? So a big piece of advice is to be continuously learning new marketable skills. So coding languages, I'm sure you guys are kind of more through R and Python. For me, like biomechanics engineering, it was we all used MATLAB. Like that was just the academic standard. But as soon as I graduated, no one uses MATLAB because you have to pay for the licenses. Everyone's screw that. R and Python are free. So coding languages, so SQL, R, Python are definitely recommended. Spoken languages. So again, as I said, if you want to communicate in baseball, half your players and a lot of your staff will be Spanish speakers. So if you know Spanish, that definitely gives you a leg up. Just online courses, so like Sabermetrics 101 on edX or Math Behind Moneyball on Coursera. Those are both good courses that I felt kind of helped me in the position I'm at. And get your name and work out there. So use public data sets, start a blog, write for websites, send work to teams, go on podcasts, speak at conferences. If you get your name out there and your work, and they were kind of impressed with that presentation you did, and they see your name in the resume pile for interview, they'll be like, all right, yeah, like I remember this person. I'm gonna move them to the next stage just based off that, because there's already that familiarity. And what your kind of data sets, if you're wondering where you can get data, so Kaggle, those Kaggle competitions, those are open source data sets. R, Python, SQL databases, so like PyBaseball, Baseball R, Lawman, you can get those all free. There's like NFL Fast for the NFL. There's a bunch out there. You just kind of Google free blank sport data set. I'm sure you guys all know that. You can scrape league websites, like the NHL.com is a very easy scrapable website. Sorry, there's a typo here. I didn't finish my sentence, but like the pro reference pages, so baseball reference, basketball reference, pro football reference.com, you can scrape those. You can just download a direct CSV from those, and you can pay, like, if you want the combine data for those sports, you can just pay like a small fee and get them from there. And just next kind of thing, just apply to everything. You may, if you have an undergrad degree, they might ask for a graduate degree. Make the team rule you out. Make them decide that you're not capable of doing it. Like why it doesn't cost you anything, especially when you start applying to all these jobs. You're going to have your resume done. You're going to have a cover letter that is basically a boilerplate where it says the exact same things, and you just change out LA Angels for LA Kings, right? So apply to everything. You probably won't hear back from a lot of them, unfortunately, but it's no skin off your back. As I said, go to conferences, seminar, league meetings. So even if you can't pay the conference or the league meeting fee, like those admissions can be kind of very expensive, but just go hang out. So in the league meetings, it was people just hang out, like the winter meetings, for example. There's people just hanging out in the bar, the lobby bar of the hotel, and hopefully you're outgoing and you just sit down, have a drink. They'll probably be wearing their team cards or whatever, like a team shirt or something, and just start a conversation. Just ask them, buy them a drink, and I'm sure they'll talk to you for 10, 15 minutes. They might dip out after that, but at least you kind of got your name in your foot in the door, name out there, and just give them a business card and reach out later on. And like going along with this, just network. Oh man, just network every opportunity you can. Like I know I don't really have to tell you guys this because you're already in a sports analytics group, but it's so important. As awful as it sounds, like it's not what you know, it's who you know, and it's crazy how true that is in the sports world. That as a job opening comes up, there's a lot of people looking for it, and it's just much easier for us to just kind of take someone's suggestion and slide that into that role. So networking is really important. So some final thoughts to kind of tie everything together is building good models is hard to begin with. Noisy sports data just makes it all harder. So, collaborate, keep it simple when possible, and think deeply about all models, variations, parameters, all those things that, the simple things matter, right? Think hard about those questions and think hard about every different thing that goes into a model. And communication is king. So as I said, a lot of people will not understand what you do. So being able to translate that knowledge, that's really important. Being able to translate to that player and getting the message across. Your model isn't good if no one understands it. It could be a perfect model, but if no one understands the result of it or how to use it. So for example, a PCA feeding into a neural network, and they're gonna you're like, all right, like these PCs are super important to predict, anything, like I don't know, sprint speed, things like that. And they're gonna well, what's a PC? And you'd be like, it's not a real thing. It counts for the variability. It becomes very hard to communicate that. So think hard about what your features and your future engineering and how that can be communicated later on. Think about that on the outset. Use different mediums and analogies, kind of like players and coaches love heuristics. So as awful as it sounds, kind of boil things down for them, make it simple for them. And don't view confrontation as a negative. It's an opportunity to get better. There's always going to be people that disagree with you, but take what they're saying into consideration. They probably know things that you don't know either, so that's really important to factor that in. And it's kind of what I think is the most important thing is it's nullius e verba. This is the Latin motto for the Royal Society of Science. So in London, one of the most prestigious societies in all of the world, and it means take nobody's word for it. So if someone tells you something, or if there's like an age-old belief in the sport you're interested in, test it out. Poke it, prod it, try and figure out what's going on. And if it holds past the sniff test, if it holds true, perfect. If it doesn't, fix it. Change the game. So yeah, thanks for your time. If you have any questions we don't get to